Today's build is going to be this cabinet that I built for a Grizzly 11 by 36 inch lathe. I picked it up for quite a steal here locally, and I needed a place to put it. So the basics of the cabinet is that it's got two drawers. This one drawer has all the tool holders, extra bits and stuff in it, some wrenches. The second drawer holds gears and stuff that I'll need to change once in a while, but things that I'll use a whole lot less often. Down below, it's got two doors that are held closed just by magnetic latches, and those hold the lathe, some extra lathe chucks, and some face plates and stuff. So anyway, let's get started. Thanks for watching. So this project started a few months ago. You can see there in the back I was building my flip top cabinet, or my flip top cart for my other tools, and I had these offcuts left over from two pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, and here I'm applying epoxy to glue them together. I use epoxy because it fills in the indentations, the unevenness in the plywood, especially where this is just construction grade plywood. So I start in one corner and I kind of work out across it in a diagonal fashion from one end to the other, because you can see it's got a little bit of a bow in it. And I grab some clamps here to help me pull it together while I add the screws. And I actually screw it on both sides, but you only see me screw the one side here. So then I started on the frame, and these parts I end up being the legs, and I just joint them on two sides to get a square reference. So once I've got all the pieces jointed, I take them, and because the legs are going to be dimensionally about 3 by 3 inches, I glue them together. So I glue those together and I clamp them, and I actually end up leaving them for a couple days. A few days later when I come back, I pull those out of the clamps, and I take them back to the joiner, and I re-square them on two sides. And I don't show it, but I rip down the long edge just a little bit on the table saw, and then I take those to the planer and I plane those to the final dimension, which, like I said, ends up being just a little bit over 3 inches square. So when I plane those, or when I joint those legs on the two sides, you can also see I joint the rest of the frame boards as well at that time. And then I take them all out to the planer, and I plane them down to their final thickness, which ends up being about 1.25 inches to clean up both sides, get them square. So on the legs and all the rest of the pieces, I trim one side of it to true it up, and then using that side as the reference, I measure and cut all the pieces to the final dimensions that I'm going to be gluing them up at. So I use biscuit joints to join all this. Right here I'm transferring some measurements to one of the legs, and then I'll use a square to transfer that measurement from that leg to the rest of the legs. I then take all the pieces, the cross members and stuff from the frames, and I cut a small dado out of them that's going to accept a piece of 1/4 inch plywood. So here I add the biscuit joints to all the frame pieces, and I do 2 biscuit joints per joint. And you can see here in this initial dry fit, down there in the bottom right hand of the screen, the 2x4 has two cutouts for biscuits. And then you can see here where I've got it all kind of clamped and dry fit together. Everything's going together well. All the dados for the outside plywood are lining up really good. And I start gluing it together. I start with the back panel. The center piece you see me gluing up is going to be where the cross member for the drawer slides attaches to the front and back panels. So the back panel was just a little bit out of square, you can see here. I grab a couple of bar clamps and square that up. And then the front panel I glued in the same fashion, just without any of the 1/4 inch plywood, and it ends up being pretty square on the first try. I got lucky with that one. After I get this front panel all lined up, I add a couple of clamps so that I can put it down on the floor and get it all squared up, and I add a whole bunch more clamps to it. So that plywood top you saw me glue together with the epoxy in the beginning, I mount that to the top using a subfloor adhesive. That's because there's going to be some vibration on the table, and this will help fill in the gaps, and it'll also withstand that vibration really well. Once I get it all lined up, I pre-drill it, and then I fasten it down just using some 3-inch deck screws. So those cross members that you see in there, the one in the center is for the drawer slides, and then the others you see that I've added all that bracing. That is where the lathe is actually going to mount. I'm going to put some bolts down through that, but I put it there to support the lathe.
I add a 1.5 by 1.5 edging to the very top of it. So there's that 1.5 by 1.5 kind of a top rail around the top that you can see that I added. And then I go ahead and I sand everything down to a 220 grit using just my orbital sander. So just prior to this, I added a coat of Danish oil, just a natural finish, and for some reason I don't have the video for that. And here I'm just marking out some holes that I add some casters that as you can see in the back there, I've got some chimney pipe, and I've been working in my shop in really cold weather, so I had to move the lathe onto the cabinet there so I could get to my table where I could do some welding and some other stuff so that I could get my fireplace put back in. We had a snowstorm that dumped 18 inches and it just tore my old chimney off of my shop. So the drawer boxes are just 1/2 inch Baltic birch, and I use glue and brad nails to assemble the box. So once I've got the drawer boxes, I set them off to the side to dry, and I move on to building the doors and the drawer fronts. And I join a couple more pieces of 2x4 here to get some good edges on them, and I plane those down, and then I resaw those in half. Once I've got those resawn, I take them back out to the planer and I plane them down to a 1/2 inch thickness. I'm cutting a rabbet joint out of the back side of the drawers to accept that 1/4 inch plywood. It's just a 1/4 inch deep rabbet, and then I do the same thing on the drawer fronts. So I use some biscuit joints here in the doors to connect them. And here I glue up both of the door fronts. I've just got a band clamp there, and I get both doors set in those band clamps. So just like the frame, I sand everything down to 220 grit, and then I apply a natural Danish oil finish to the doors and the drawer fronts, and I set those aside to dry for a day or two. So once that Danish oil had dried, I moved on to mounting the doors and the drawer fronts. I started with the drawer fronts, and I just used some thick and quick tight bond and a couple of areas of super glue with some accelerator. So I mount the hinges just using a square to hold them equidistant off of the top and bottom, and then mark the holes. I pre-drilled them. It's pine. I didn't want it to split, and I just mount those there. I try to use some super glue to hold the hinges, and you'll see here that not everything goes to plan. I tried to use some super glue to hold them on while I drilled the holes in the frame to mount those. And I get the bottom hole done, and as I'm doing the top hole, you'll see that there it goes. Not everything works out as planned. Sometimes you just got to change your plans. So I did that by just mounting the screw that I already had drilled, and then marked out the top holes and drilled those, and put the rest of the screws in that way. So then I had the drawer fronts and the doors mounted. I moved on to putting some handles on. And I made a quick jig that you'll see here in a second when I'm doing the drawer fronts to drill the holes in the doors and the drawers. And the cabinet's basically done, so I've cleared out a spot, moved some things around, because this is going to be a semi-permanent location for this lathe, but I wheel it into place. And then I just kick those casters up, and it's basically there.